Hello and welcome to Design Emergency. I'm Alice Rawsthorn, co-founder of Design Emergency with Paolo Antonelli, and we're thrilled that the pioneering social designer and activist Hilary Cottam, who was among our first interviewees when Paolo and I launched Design Emergency 5 years ago, is back to discuss her latest project, a book on the urgent need to redesign all aspects of work. So welcome back, Hilary.
Hello, Alice. I'm so honoured and delighted to be with you again. Thank you.
Oh, well, lovely to have you back here. Now, entitled The Work We Need, a 21st Century Reimagining, Hilary's book will be published next month. Her own work has made a huge impact on design and its relationship to society. After working on urban poverty projects in southern Africa, Hilary conducted 20 years of practical experiments in the UK by applying design to address complex social problems with the aim of redesigning the welfare state. She shared this work in her first book, Radical Help, which is essential reading for designers and social scientists. The Work We Need is the product of intensive research conducted by Hilary over the last 5 years in interviews and workshops in the UK and US on how to rethink our approach to work from Barnsley and Grimsby to Detroit and Palo Alto. Having heard from workers, employers, entrepreneurs, academics, policymakers and others about their experiences and analyses of work in the age of McJobs, isostrain, doomscrolling, racial outsourcing, gig economies and other sources of oppression, Hilary shares their answers to the book's fundamental question, how can we redesign our working lives? So Hilary, why did you decide to write a book about work?
Well, I think, as you've described, I've been running social projects for a long time, thinking about how we redesign our social systems. And of course, places where we most need social support are usually places where work is not functioning, that there's either not a lot of work or the work that's on offer is badly paid and not very good work. So I have been working for a long time in places where there is a work crisis. But perhaps foolishly or ironically, I hadn't really thought very much about the work side of things until I began to write Radical Help. And I stepped back from being a social entrepreneur for a while and, began to have time and space to think. And of course, when our social systems were designed in the UK, the US, across Europe, the idea was that they would support people into work, that you would get a good education, you would have a good job. And if there was a period when you were out of work, then the welfare state would step in, either because you were unwell or because you needed retraining. But what's happened over the last decades is that this arrangement and this kind of relationship between welfare and work has become completely out of step. And what we've tried to do is to prop up bad work through the welfare state, either through kind of very big transfers to people, in-work benefits where corporations don't pay high enough salaries, for example, which are really critical, but is a kind of very weird way of supporting work. Or through kind of, increasing demands for sort of mental health support and things because people are living very difficult lives. And so very conscious that I was working in these places without good work. And because I'm not an economist myself, I started off by asking people, the politicians who represent these places and policymakers, what's going on with work? What are you doing about work? How are you going to get good work in the places where your people who vote for you live? And usually, Alice, their response was to go like this and to go, I just don't know. And I thought, well, this is a complete crisis. I need to find out and I need to kind of go out there and ask. And so essentially that's what drove the work, was just this question of like, have I been working on the wrong side of the coin? Don't we need to kind of get work right before we begin to think about social systems?
And you've mentioned good work several times and its opposite, bad work. What do you mean by that?
Yes. Yeah, so I think that good work has to offer us the basics. Good work has to offer us a level of independence where without worry, we can afford a decent home, a decent life. We can heat our home, we have good food to eat. I worked for a long time with the ideas of the philosopher Amartya Sen, and what he talks about poverty is that, the sort of antithesis of poverty is being able to fit in with our peers, that we have to be able to go to our neighbour's birthday party and be able to take a gift. We can't, not be able to socially function. So I think if our work doesn't allow us as individuals, families, communities to live in that decent way, then this is not good work. But that's not enough. the basics are sort of a baseline. There are other elements which I talk about in the book. And of course, one of the most important is meaning or purpose, by which I don't mean, working for a corporation that's got a purpose. People are very mocking about that. But what I mean is that the work offers us a path to find our own identity, our own meaning, and our own purpose. I think that we find who we are through the work that we do. It's not that we are only driven by the work that we do, but this is a really important way of constituting ourselves as humans, constituting our relationships. So I think that that's a very important part of it. And so I spend quite a lot of time thinking in the book with people, like what is work with purpose? And I find that people who think their work is good are people who their work has three characteristics, really. One is it's about making. They have the possibility of making something end to end. So I work, for example, in the nuclear weapons, the nuclear submarine facility in Barrow, where people work on nuclear submarines for 7 years from the beginning to the end of that project. I work with craftspeople who can, do different things, art forms, design forms, knitting, whatever. And that's a very important part of it. Another part of it is that through your work, you feel that you have a place in your community and in the world. And then, of course, there's a subjective part of it, which is, we might come on to, which is that in this century, in a time of kind of ecological crisis in particular, what is good work? Good work might be good for me, but if it's actually kind of damaging the planet, can we still think about that as good work? And these are the things that the workers that I was working alongside discussed. But then, of course, there's a bigger question of balance, which is that good work has to allow us time to care, time to play, time to be. And so in the book, I have this idea that we need to move away from the sort of industrial concept of Homo economicus, this, this caricature of a man that just wants to kind of be driven by profit, by material need, to kind of have working lives that enable us to develop the whole part of ourselves where life and work is in balance. And I suppose the other thing to add to that is that it's a collective project. So this isn't a book, nor is it an idea about life-work balance. It's about how collectively, as societies, we find this new way forward, really, in which we can all thrive.
And what convinced you that it was timely to address these issues now?
Well, I suppose both ends convinced me, working from the micro and the macro. On the one hand, as I've described, I'm in places where good work is very hard to find. Often there is actually good work, but it's not available for local people, which is also a very kind of interesting dynamic that policymakers often seem oblivious to. So there's this sort of very kind of acute visceral experience I have day to day in my own working life of being alongside people who can't find good work. But at the same time, I think some of the kind of bigger shifts have, become a confluence, if you like, in the last decade at least. So, both technology, digital, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, these are forces that are dramatically changing our work already in front of our eyes. The ecological crisis, I actually think it's ecology, not technology, that's going to drive the most immediate changes in work, because if we want to reach net zero, 70% of us need to change what we do. And yet we have, in no European country, and certainly not in the United States, there's no plan for how we might get to that point. And then the other thing is that we can see, particularly amongst younger generations, but not only, that there is an increasing concern for issues of justice, social justice. People want to do work that contributes and also don't want to be part of kind of economic systems through their own work that are harming other people. So I think we're at a point where we're asking very, very big macro questions, all of which impact our own daily lives through work. And so we have to think about work. And of course, originally I studied history, so I know that these moments come periodically through time when these very big sort of seismic shifts mean that work changes. And it's not, it's not technologically driven in the sense of it's not done to us. These moments are times when if we think and if we design, we can change work in ways that benefit us as humanity. And in this case, of course, hopefully our natural systems. So it seems it's really the moment.
And you've referred to the intensive research process that you undertook in order to produce the book. How did you approach it, and what role did design play in that process?
Yes, so this is a book about the imagination, and I think that this is a book that only design could have produced. And so what I did was I worked with the design organisation Humanly to think about how we might have these imagination sessions. So I designed what was really a kind of 3-hour immersion where we looked at these two questions, like what is a good working life in this century and how would we get there? And I had a sort of series of kind of visual prompts and things to kind of enable people to engage in questions which they're usually not thinking about. And that was one of the most interesting things of the work, of people saying, but this is so interesting because we never talk about this. We never talk about it amongst ourselves. We never talk about it as colleagues. It's very interesting to think in this way. And I think that, so I had these tools in my rucksack. I traveled along on my own. It was really exciting and energizing for me because as I'd grown participle that did the social system work bigger and bigger, of course, I'd become, slightly not detached from the work. That's not quite the case. But, obviously I was running an organization with lots of people, raising money. And suddenly it was just me, a rucksack, traveling. I liken it in the book to pilgrimages, having to stay often in people's houses because there was nowhere to stay and people had to put me up, and finding people to work with. So I think that the sort of visual design tools were really, really important in sort of prompting imagination on the one hand. I think that it's very interesting that in work and in many aspects of our life, politics is a really good example as well, that we don't actually have settled views. We normally answer questions according to what we think the listener or the kind of interrogator or whatever wants to hear. And so I think it's really interesting, for example, that many of the places that I have worked have been places which have got a lot of immigrant populations in their local hotels, and how people talked very, very differently and inclusively about those immigrant populations compared to kind of what is often represented in the press. So I think we say different things according to where we're standing and how imaginative, whether we feel we can really talk from the heart or whether we think we have to kind of say what we're expected to say. And I think that design is really, really important to that process. And then, of course, the other part of it is that this is a book about how we might make practical change, and design is very good strategically for thinking about how we move from ideas to change. But I mean, it is a book with design at its heart. I don't think I could have ever had these conversations, and the ideas were built in the process. It's not like people were rehearsing things they'd already thought. Of course, there's an element of that, but people, grew ideas, rejected ideas. It was a very, very dynamic process, the 3 hours that I spent. Well, I did hundreds and hundreds of them, but with each small group.
And you adopted a similar methodology when you were researching for the experiments described in Radical Help. How has the process changed since then?
I'm constantly evolving and always feeling that I'm in the foothills of design as well. And obviously, when I started the social systems work a couple of decades ago, we were sort of borrowing product design methodologies, any tools we could. Then we were kind of experimenting with service design. I got very frustrated because I think these are sort of, capitalist tools, for want of a better word. You're also sort of always, they're sort of pre-programmed in some way to kind of produce something that you then want to sell to somebody. And I've been kind of thinking about, with the social systems work, I was always saying service last. What can we kind of invent and imagine that isn't a traditional service? And I suppose since then I've been, really trying to kind of think about how we go further and we go differently. And I suppose the work's become much more imaginative. In the pandemic, I obviously couldn't work in a kind of visual way and I couldn't get out and about. And I began to work with Gemma Mortensen and her team at New Constellations just with audio. So we did lots of work just through sound. And that was really, really interesting. And again, that sort of made me think differently about when I went back to kind of visual work, how could I kind of adapt the practice in relationship to that? So I think that this work was so open-ended and asked people to step into an imaginative space. I say in the book, when I started, because there's a tea break in the middle of the 3 hours, and I always thought, are people going to leave? Is this kind of too weird? But people didn't leave. In fact, they wanted to stay. So I think that was a really important part of the kind of imagination in the process, and the fact that it was so immersive. And I had no idea what I would find. It wasn't commissioned by anybody, so it wasn't funded that I had to find anything. So the other thing that was really important in this work was that with Humanly, I designed materials that didn't need a facilitator. So I could turn up and I could work with anybody. And so what I did was I would explain how you could use the materials, and people sometimes did, and sometimes they did all kinds of weird things with them. And then I would put a tape recorder on the table and I would let the process run. So I didn't intervene in any way, if essentially there was kind of no facilitation. And that was very exciting to me as well, because I'm always trying to think how I remove myself more and more from a creative process.
And in terms of what the research yielded, what surprised you the most, first negatively and then second positively?
Well, the negative is really hard. I think the most negative thing is also, it's like a job interview, the flip side of the positive, which is that I suppose the richness of ideas was extraordinary. And I think it's really, really interesting what ideas we don't hear, whether that's kind of as the general public or even as managers. I mean, one example would be, normally I don't allow anybody else in the room, but when I was working in the nuclear submarine factory in Barrow, it's a national project of kind of secrecy, if you like. So they said to me, well, you've got to have somebody from human resources. You can't just sort of wander around as you like. And so I had somebody who was really nice, and there was a little room on the side. I mean, it was really a cupboard. And I said to her, would you mind sitting here? Because then people, I knew everybody would forget that she was there, which is of course what happened. And then every time she'd come out at the end of each sort of 3-hour session, she was like, this is incredible. Like we can't have these conversations with our workers. Their ideas are more advanced than ours. And yet we've got no way of having this very open dialogue about what could happen. So I suppose, if you like, the negative is that we're not hearing these things. And I think often when we don't hear ideas, especially in the current context, then those ideas become violent, if you like. They kind of go underground and they become quite difficult. So I suppose that would be the negative side of things.
And the positive side?
Well, the positive is enormous. So I suppose the positive, I mean, when, there was a very famous 1970s sort of journey by an American journalist called Studs Terkel, and he wrote this book based on it called Working. And he says in the book that he was amazed by the imagination of ordinary workers in America. And I suppose because I'd been working in this way for so long, I wasn't amazed by ideas, I expected ideas. But what I was absolutely amazed by was how the same themes, the same ideas, which are the 6 core themes in the book, were repeated every single time. And actually the reason I wrote a book was because the same things happened again and again. And I thought this is extraordinary because these are ideas that we sort of hear of, but it was like a kind of turn of the kaleidoscope, that they kind of had a different pattern in the way they were emerging. So a really good example is time. I mean, my first workshop was with people who dig municipal parks, clean municipal parks, and grave diggers in Kilmarnock in Ayrshire in Scotland. And they immediately seized the paper and began to redesign what they called a non-linear life, and had these really radical ideas about how they would interpret time to reinterpret work and life. And, these were people who'd left school at 14 and 16 and had never been part of this process, and their ideas were just brilliant. And I was transfixed. But then sort of 2 years later in a boardroom in London, again, the same ideas came back. A consultant got to her feet and said, what do we need to fix time? We're fed up of having our time robbed. We don't want to make partner. We don't, the bargain is not right. And so these same themes came back again and again. And I found that really interesting. And just to sort of talk about time, so time came and people talked, let's say, about a 4-day working week, or better, a 32-hour, what would it be? It would be I can't do them, a 32-hour working week. But that was just for them a tactic. They had very different ideas about how you would weave work and life together that I haven't heard before. And that was really interesting.
And what were the other 5 key themes? You said there were 6 that came up.
Yes. So obviously the one theme is the basics, which in the book is quite a painful chapter because so many people, are not earning minimum wage, that we have so little enforcement actually when you don't earn minimum wage, and how really painful people's lives are that aren't earning minimum wage. So the basics chapter is quite painful. There's obviously, there's meaning. The next thing that came up a lot was care and repair. I was really surprised at how much people centre care in their lives, often young people. So these aren't people necessarily with children or older relatives, but feeling this idea that we're standing in a hollow and that things, how we used to kind of care for one another in quite a loose but important way, have been hollowed out. People, and I say care and repair because people wove together in very interesting ways, care for each other and for nature. Time, as I've said, was very important. Play was very important. I hadn't really thought about play, I'm embarrassed to say. Perhaps I just worked too hard myself. But people really wanted to think about what spaces in life draw on different parts of their imagination regularly and are not commercialised and kind of open up different possibilities. And then place was becomes a very, very important theme in the book. What does it mean to be attached to place? What does it mean when we want to kind of invent economies in place that aren't there at the moment?
And are there any other key priorities that you believe, as a result of your research, we need to address to make our working lives more empowering and more productive?
Well, I suppose one of the biggest lessons in the book really is about how we think of work as an economic category. Generally, I say, a work is L in the kind of economist equations, and we tend to leave questions of work to economists and economic policymakers. And it's really clear that work, of course, it has an economic function. As I've said, we need to have the basics, but work is a cultural, social function, actually. That's what its root is in our lives. And I think, that we can only transform work if we organise. I've said that this is a collective project, and when big changes in work happen, whether it's having a minimum wage or whether it's kind of equality of pay or the end of slavery, when big things happen, it's because workers collectively come together in different ways. And we could talk about how that itself has to be redesigned, the way that we work together, and fight for something different. And I think what's really important is that the dominant narrative is, if we just take the UK and the US, but this is very typical globally, is like, let's grow our economies. When our economies have grown and are flourishing, let's invest in social infrastructure. Then we can invest in clubs and libraries and playgrounds and everything else. What's really, really clear from the work in the book is it's absolutely the other way around. Let's invest in social infrastructure so that people can get together, can share ideas, can grow things, and rich and dense social infrastructure, not just one work club or one library, but lots of dense overlapping infrastructure. And out of that, actually, economies grow. And we've got it the wrong way round.
And can you share examples of initiatives that are already addressing these issues successfully? Because one of the lovely things about the book is, yes, you identify lots and lots of problems and challenges, but also you celebrate the way that some people have risen to the challenge and have developed successful solutions.
I think that's really important. And also just to say, I think that's what's so beautiful about the Imaginings is that everybody who came, we've all got complaints, but immediately used that to kind of invent something else. So they were very, very uplifting. It was just I loved the work. And yes, there's lots going on. And so what you see is sort of really small things that can really make a difference, and then really big things. So an example of a small thing would be that I think if every employer imagined every employee as a carer, just imagined that everybody has caring responsibilities, that would make work better for everybody. And so an example would be, I went to a factory in Baltimore where they actually pay quite well. They assemble housing, kind of, I want to call it pre-packed housing. I can't think what the word would be. But and they've invested a lot in technology so that the work is not so physically onerous that many people can do it. And they thought in particular they would attract a woman workforce, and they haven't. So I said, what happens when people come to work? Where do they put their mobile phones? And they said, the mobile phones go in the lockers you saw on the way in. Now, most women at some point in their lives, unfortunately, until we have more radical social change, are responsible for their children, for their elderly parents. And in a case of emergency, they need to be able to take a call and prize work where they can do that if there's an emergency. So they generally don't take work where you have to put the mobile phone somewhere else. So it's a really small thing that could really change the kind of gender balance of your workforce. But then also, in the book, I'm really interested in what I call new industrialists, who are business leaders that understand this momentous moment we're living in and are thinking differently about what could be good for business, because they realise that to grow business, they need to think differently. And a really good example would be Catalyte in Baltimore, started by Mike Rosenberg. And so he's a lawyer, and he'd worked in Moscow in the 90s. He moved back to Baltimore, and he was really, really shocked at how technology had distorted the city, basically kind of growing the kind of John Hopkins Meditech complex at the heart, which is good for sort of highly educated, generally white workers, and left these black wings, familiar to many of us from the TV series The Wire, where it would be physically impossible to make that journey from the wings to the kind of good jobs. And his thing was, okay, so technology has distorted the city. I'm going to use the technology we have now to kind of change this. And so he worked very hard to kind of, train an AI app that can determine whether you can be a coder. And so he puts adverts according to zip codes in US papers. He started in Baltimore, he's expanded. And he offers above minimum wage to train as a coder. And then, very interestingly, collectively supports people into very good jobs, either with sort of very famous companies like Nike or Microsoft, but also kind of with corporate law firms and everything else. And it's just an extremely successful business with thousands of employees that has really gone against the grain. And I love it because it's a really, really good story of somebody who has built a brilliant business, has seen that the biggest problem to his business was going to be how to get enough talent in the US, and has thought a very clever way around it, which has grown first Baltimore and now other places. But I think what's really interesting, and what I say about in the book, is that I had this experience so many times. So I go to Catalyte and I meet him and his CEO and workers, and I come back, wherever, like maybe to dinner with, friends, and I'm like, it's incredible what I've seen. And people always dismiss it. They say, oh, well, yes, there are always kind of odd people that do these crazy things, but this is not the way of business. And I think what's really important actually is that this is the way of business. And it's particularly the way of business where CEOs and corporate head people understand the places that they come from and have a root still to those places. And it's really interesting what stories we tell and what stories we hear. They're not the CEOs that generally go to Davos or get interviewed by the FT. So we don't hear enough of those stories. But I think that a lot is changing. And a lot of those CEOs, of course, feel quite isolated because they know they're a bit renegade. And it would be very, very interesting to have, I would like to do a podcast on the new industrialists because I think there are so many of them. And it would be very, very interesting to show how big this movement is.
Well, I think you definitely should. But if we look at the broad picture, what needs to happen to achieve radical change at the scale that's required to make a meaningful difference? And what contribution will design make to that process, or could it make to the process?
Yes, so that's a really big question, which I tackle in the last part of the book. So I think the first thing is it does matter what stories we tell and who tells those stories, and understanding that there is already imagination, there are already good experiments. But I think that when we have revolutions in any form, velvet revolutions like the invention of the welfare state, I don't mean violent revolution, that sort of four sort of stratas of society have to be part of it and have to come together. And actually, there's a certain point in most technology revolutions where that happens. So one is the state has to step back in, and it has to kind of change the rules of the game towards what I would call a moral economy, where, the sort of guardrails are there. And yes, profit is a motive, but, we can't have sort of, crazy financialization. Intellectuals have a really important role to play because they legitimize new ideas. And I think one of the really interesting and exciting things is that we're seeing a really, really fundamental challenge at the moment to heterodox economics, which shows that we can and should think differently about work, and that will be better for business and the planet. And I think that's very exciting. So intellectuals, the state, communities obviously have a role to play, and workers. And the most important thing, I think, is that workers have to organise, and that organisation has to be different. And I think that is, obviously the state can use design to think about how it differently kind of tilts the playing fields. But I think that for workers, design is a really important strategic tool to think about how we come together in new ways. Obviously, we have had this extraordinary kind of legacy of industrial trade unions, which are still alive and still very important today. But they were designed to kind of mirror the industries of the 20th century, and often are not very successful at confronting the kind of power of the 21st century. And so I think we have to think very differently about how we now design collaboration, drawing on those roots, but kind of reimagining, which many kind of union leaders are starting to do, but so are kind of other pockets. And I think it's really important that those organisations are and can use design really strategically. And as part of my work, just simply spending an hour and a half and asking workers to design an organisation on a tablecloth to think how you would kind of use design for social institution making yielded really rich results.
And what would success look like?
Well, I suppose the thing about success is that success would look like a just transition. And I suppose the thing about success is that we're going to have a transition. I mean, it's coming. So the question is, can we make that transition just? By which I mean that we kind of move from sort of 20th century extractive work to 21st century regenerative good work in a way that leaves no one behind, because that involves, I think, transition incomes, different to kind of, incomes for everybody, but for people who need to make that transition because they're in very high carbon jobs, whether it's, actually in the carbon or being an air hostess or whatever it is. But also that we need new forms of learning, we need new forms of collaboration. And so the question would be, success would be really if we can think about how to invest in that infrastructure, that social infrastructure that we need to move collectively from where we are now to where we need to be. And so that we can actually shape, because we're in a moment and we can, that moment is not really happening to us, even if we're told it is. It's a moment that we can shape, and we should sort of actively get ready and shape. And I mean, one of the examples I draw on in the book is, the slave economy of the 18th century, which is very like the carbon economy. In the 19th century, 18th, 19th, that cusp, everybody was part of the slave economy. You might not have owned slaves, but, where you banked and, how every village, every town in Britain was in this web. And it was incredibly complicated to think about how to get out of it. And so success involved kind of government bringing money to the table. It involved people collaborating in new ways. It involved kind of pamphleteering and protesting and thinking at a system level, how do we kind of redesign that system? And I think that's what success would look like today. So I think we've got examples, we've got an emergency, and we've got the tools. I think it's possible that we can have the success.
Well, Hilary, thank you so much for sharing your work and your ideas about the work we need with us. Not that you'll need it, but good luck with the book. I'm sure it's going to have a huge impact. And thank you all for listening. You can find images of the projects that Hilary has discussed on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And we look forward to welcoming you back soon when we'll be exploring other fascinating and urgently needed design advances, like Hilary's quest to redesign work. Goodbye.